Welcome to Whispers of the Night. Tonight we journey to Oxford in December 1932, where within the study of Ashwell College, a renowned professor lies dead over his revolutionary manuscript on Elizabeth and secrets. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also join our membership for ad-free videos and exclusive mysteries. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Reading your comments always bring me joy and motivation. Now, settle in with a hot cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. Murder at Ashwell College, Chapter 1. An Invitation to Oxford. It was a crisp December morning when the invitation arrived at our flat in Whitehaven Mansions. I had been engaged in the rather mundane task of sorting through correspondence when my attention was caught by an envelope of exceptional quality, heavy cream paper with an embossed crest that spoke of old money and older traditions. "I say, Poirot," I called to my friend, who was at that moment arranging his morning newspapers with his customary precision. "There's rather an interesting letter here addressed to you." Poirot looked up from his task, his egg-shaped head tilting slightly as his green eyes fixed upon the envelope in my hand. "Ah, mon ami. And what makes this correspondence so interesting, if you please?" "Well, it's from Lady Margaret Winthrop, you know, the philanthropist. Rather grand paper, I must say." Poirot's eyebrows rose with evident interest. He set aside his newspapers and approached with that peculiar, precise gait of his, extending one perfectly manicured hand for the letter, breaking the seal with his ivory paper knife. He would never, under any circumstances, simply tear open an envelope. He read the contents with growing attention. "Most curious," he murmured after a moment. "Lady Margaret requests the honour of our presence at Ashwell College, Oxford, for what she terms a most significant literary occasion. It appears that one Professor Edwin Selby is to unveil a manuscript of considerable historical importance." "Oxford," I said, warming to the idea immediately. "Haven't been back to the old university town in years. Rather pleasant in winter, I should think. But I say, Poirot, what's this about our presence? Surely the invitation is for you alone." Pooh's lips curved in that slight smile I knew so well. "Normal, cher Hastings. Lady Margaret is most specific. She writes, 'I should be delighted if Captain Hastings might accompany you, as I understand he possesses both literary interests and a keen appreciation for academic pursuits.'" He paused, regarding me with those penetrating eyes. "It would appear, my friend, that your reputation precedes you." I must confess, I was rather flattered, though I wondered what had prompted Lady Margaret to include me in what was evidently to be a select gathering. Still, the prospect of an evening among scholars discussing historical revelations held considerable appeal. "What manner of revelations might these be?" I inquired. Poirot refolded the letter with characteristic care. "Lady Margaret is somewhat, how shall I put it, circumspect in her details. She mentions only that Professor Selby's research concerns Elizabeth and state secrets, and that his findings may cause quite a sensation among historians." He paused, his head tilting thoughtfully. There is something in her tone, Hastings, a certain anxiety beneath the formal courtesy that suggests this invitation may not be entirely social in nature. Anxiety, whatever could cause a lady of her standing to be anxious about a scholarly presentation? Ah, that is indeed the question, is it not? Poirot moved to the window, gazing out at the London street below. "Lady Margaret Winthrop comes from one of England's oldest families, a lineage that stretches back to Tudor times, if I am not mistaken, when one's ancestors have been prominent for centuries. Revelations about Elizabeth and secrets might prove uncomfortable." The implication was not lost on me, though I found it difficult to imagine that ancient history could trouble anyone in our modern age. Still, I had learned to trust Poirot's instincts about such matters. "When is this gathering to take place?" I asked. "Tomorrow evening. We are to arrive at Ashwell College by 6, where Professor Selby will conduct a private reading in his study for a select group of guests." Poirot returned to his desk, already reaching for his fountain pen. "I shall accept, naturally." This Professor Selby has intrigued me considerably. A man who has devoted his life to uncovering secrets that others have kept buried for 3 centuries must be a person of remarkable determination. As Pooh began composing his reply, I found myself anticipating our journey to Oxford with unexpected enthusiasm. There was something rather romantic about the idea of gathering in a scholar's study to hear revelations about the great figures of history. How pleasant it would be to spend an evening among academics discussing matters of historical import, rather than the sordid details of crime and murder that so often occupied our time. I settled back into my chair with the morning paper, already imagining the ancient stones of Oxford, the gas-lit studies, and the learned conversation that awaited us. It promised to be a most civilized and enlightening experience, quite a change from our usual adventures. How little did I suspect, as I read the mundane news of that December morning, that within 24 hours we would be faced with a puzzle more intricate and deadly than any we had yet encountered. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. Our journey to Oxford on the following evening proved most agreeable, though I noticed that Poirot maintained an unusual silence as our train wound through the countryside. The winter twilight was settling over the spires of the ancient university, as our taxi deposited us at the gates of Ashwell College, where the porter directed us through a series of cobbled courtyards to Professor Selby's quarters. The professor's study occupied the ground floor of a Tudor building that must have witnessed centuries of scholarly endeavour. Tall windows looked out upon a formal garden now shrouded in December mist, while inside the panelled walls were lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. The room possessed that particular atmosphere of learning and tradition that only Oxford can provide, a sense of accumulated wisdom and quiet authority. Lady Margaret Winthrop greeted us at the door with a warmth that seemed to my eye somewhat forced. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 55, with iron-grey hair arranged in an elegant coiffure and wearing a gown of deep blue silk that spoke of considerable expense. Her manner was gracious, yet I detected a tension about her eyes and a certain stiffness in her smile. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, extending her hand. "How delighted I am that you could join us for this most significant evening. Professor Selby has been looking forward to sharing his discoveries with such distinguished guests." Professor Edwin Selby proved to be a man of perhaps 60, tall and lean, with the scholarly stoop that comes from years bent over ancient documents. His grey beard was meticulously trimmed, and his dark eyes held the intense gleam of one who has spent his life pursuing elusive truths. He welcomed us with evident pleasure, though I noticed he seemed somewhat nervous, repeatedly adjusting his spectacles and smoothing his waistcoat. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of one accustomed to lecturing halls, "I trust you will find this evening's revelations of interest. I have spent the better part of 5 years researching the material I shall present tonight, and I believe it will quite revolutionize our understanding of certain, shall we say, delicate matters from our Tudor past." As we accepted glasses of excellent port, I took the opportunity to observe our fellow guests. Dr. Julian Cross, whom Lady Margaret introduced as Professor of History at the college, was a man of middle years with thinning hair and an air of barely contained impatience. He possessed one of those sharp, intelligent faces that suggest a mind always at work, though there was something in his manner toward Professor Selby that struck me as less than cordial. "Selby's work promises to be quite comprehensive," Dr. Cross remarked to us, though his tone suggested something other than admiration. "He has always been most thorough in his research methods." Standing quietly near Professor Selby's massive oak desk was a woman of perhaps 40, plainly but neatly dressed, with intelligent grey eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. This was Miss Dorothy Hale, Professor Selby's secretary, who had served in that capacity for some 20 years. She moved about the room with quiet efficiency, ensuring that everyone had refreshment and that the professor's materials were properly arranged for his presentation. "Miss Hale is indispensable to my work," Professor Selby informed us with evident fondness. "Her knowledge of Elizabethan documents is quite extraordinary indeed. I often think she knows my research better than I do myself." Miss Hale coloured slightly at this praise, but said nothing, merely continuing her quiet preparations, with that self-easing manner common to devoted secretaries. 3 graduate students completed our small company, young men whose eager faces and nervous deference to their seniors marked them clearly as aspirants to academic distinction. They spoke little, content to listen to their elders, and occasionally exchange meaningful glances among themselves. As the evening progressed, Professor Selby's excitement became increasingly evident. He spoke in hints and allusions about the explosive nature of his discoveries, particularly regarding certain noble families whose ancestors had played questionable roles in the political intrigues of Elizabeth's court. "History, gentlemen," he declared, gesturing with his port glass, "is often written by those who wish to conceal rather than reveal. But documents have a way of surviving, hidden in forgotten archives, waiting for the persistent researcher to uncover their secrets." I noticed Lady Margaret had grown progressively paler during these remarks, her knuckles white as she gripped her glass. Dr. Cross, meanwhile, had developed a pronounced frown, and more than once I saw him exchange sharp glances with the professor. The atmosphere in the room had grown distinctly tense by the time Professor Selby announced that he was ready to begin his formal presentation. He moved to his desk, where I observed a beautiful silver ink pot had been placed in a position of prominence, an ornate piece that seemed oddly out of place among the scholarly clutter. "A gift from Lady Margaret," Professor Selby explained, noticing my gaze. "16th century, she tells me, most appropriate for tonight's revelations." As our small company arranged ourselves in chairs facing the professor's desk, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to witness something far more significant than a simple academic presentation. The very air seemed charged with expectation and suppressed anxiety, as though secrets long buried were straining against their bonds, eager at last to see the light. Chapter 3. Words of Death. The moment Professor Selby settled himself behind his mahogany desk, the atmosphere in the study seemed to crystallize with anticipation. He had arranged his manuscript with meticulous care, the typed pages spread before him in neat order, while the ornate silver inkpot gleamed under the lamplight like some ancient talisman. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of countless lectures, "what I am about to share with you tonight represents the culmination of 5 years' intensive research into documents that have remained hidden in private collections and forgotten archives." He paused, surveying our small company with evident satisfaction. "The revelations contained within this manuscript will, I believe, fundamentally alter our understanding of certain noble families who have long enjoyed reputations built upon carefully constructed myths." I observed Lady Margaret's hands tighten imperceptibly upon her evening bag, while Dr. Cross shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miss Hale remained motionless near the bookshelf, her grey eyes fixed upon her employer with unwavering attention. Professor Selby lifted the silver inkpot slightly, admiring its craftsmanship. "How appropriate that I should use this beautiful Tudor artifact tonight," he mused. "It seems only fitting that secrets from Elizabeth's court should be revealed with an implement from that very era." He unscrewed the inkpot's ornate lid and reached for his fountain pen, an elegant instrument that I noticed he handled with particular care, as though it were precious to him. As he dipped the pen into the dark blue ink, I found myself oddly fascinated by the ritual quality of his movements. "The first document I wish to discuss," Professor Selby continued, beginning to make notes in the margin of his manuscript, "concerns the Winthrop family's involvement in the Essex Rebellion of 161. Contrary to historical records, I have discovered evidence that suggests his voice faltered slightly, and I noticed his hand tremble as he held the pen. Perhaps the excitement of the moment was affecting him more than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat and attempted to continue. Evidence that suggests the family's loyalty to the crown was not as unwavering as... The tremor in his hand had become more pronounced, and the pen slipped from his grasp, leaving an irregular blot upon the pristine manuscript. Professor Selby stared at the stain with an expression of bewilderment, as though he could not quite comprehend what had occurred. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice now noticeably unsteady. "I seem to be. That is, I feel, rather." Lady Margaret half rose from her chair. "Professor, are you quite well?" But Professor Selby did not answer. His face had grown alarmingly pale, and small beads of perspiration had appeared upon his forehead. He made a peculiar sound, half gasp, half moan, and his body began to convulse with violent spasms. "Good God!" exclaimed Dr. Cross, leaping to his feet. The scene that followed was one of such horror that I shall never forget it as long as I live. Professor Selby's convulsions intensified, his breath coming in terrible, rattling gasps. His eyes, wide with terror and confusion, sought help from those around him, but there was nothing any of us could do. Miss Hale rushed forward with a cry of distress, but before she could reach him, Professor Selby pitched forward across his desk, his arms sweeping aside the carefully arranged manuscript pages. The silver ink pot toppled, its contents spreading in a dark stain across the scattered documents. In that moment of shocked silence, I became aware of Poirot beside me. While the rest of us stood frozen in horror, my friend had moved with swift purpose toward the desk. His keen eyes took in every detail of the terrible scene, the overturned ink pod, the scattered papers, the professor's still form sprawled across his life's work. "No one must touch anything," Pooh commanded with quiet authority. "This room is now a crime scene." "Crime scene?" Dr. Cross's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Surely the poor fellow has suffered some sort of seizure. A heart attack, perhaps, or a stroke." But I knew from Poirot's expression that the matter was far more sinister than a natural death. Lady Margaret had sunk back into her chair, her face white as marble, while Miss Hale stood motionless, her hands pressed to her mouth in shock. The 3 graduate students huddled together near the window, their youthful faces marked by confusion and fear. The study, which moments before had been filled with scholarly anticipation, was now heavy with the presence of death. The manuscript pages lay scattered and ink-stained, Professor Selby's revolutionary discoveries literally buried beneath the tragedy that had befallen their author. As Poirot began his careful examination of the scene, moving with the precise, methodical manner I knew so well, I realized that our pleasant evening among academics had become something far more deadly. Whatever secrets Professor Selby had been preparing to reveal would now remain forever locked within his manuscript, unless Poirot's little grey cells could solve the mystery of how a scholar's moment of triumph had become his final act. Chapter 4. The Method Revealed. The college physician, Dr. Thornbury, arrived within a quarter of an hour of Poirot's urgent telephone call. He was a portly gentleman with silver whiskers, whose usual manner of genial bedside comfort was replaced by grave professionalism as he surveyed the tragic scene before him. "I must ask everyone to remain precisely where they are," Poirot had instructed, while we awaited the doctor's arrival. "No one is to touch anything upon or near the desk. Captain Hastings, perhaps you would be so kind as to note the exact position of each person when Professor Selby collapsed." I had done so with growing unease, marking in my mind where Lady Margaret sat wringing her hand, where Dr. Cross paced restlessly by the fireplace, where Miss Hale stood frozen near the bookshelf, and where the 3 graduate students huddled by the tall windows. The scene had the quality of a tableau, each figure locked in place by shock, and I suspected by something more sinister. Dr. Thornbury completed his preliminary examination with the thoroughness of long medical practice. When he straightened from the professor's still form, his expression was grave indeed. "I must tell you," he announced to our assembled company, "that this was no natural death. The symptoms, I observed, the convulsions, the rapid onset, the particular pallor of the skin, these are consistent with poisoning by some form of alkaloid toxin." Lady Margaret uttered a small cry and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Dr. Cross ceased his pacing and stared at the physician with evident shock. "Poisoning," he repeated. "But that's impossible. We all shared the same port, the same refreshments. If there were poison in the food or drink, surely we would all be affected." "Precisely the question that intrigues me," said Poirot quietly. He had been examining the overturned ink-pot with minute attention, careful not to disturb its position. "Dr. Thornbury, would you say the poison acted quickly?" "Very quickly, indeed. From the onset of symptoms to death could not have been more than 2 or 3 minutes." This suggests a concentrated dose of something quite potent and administered very recently. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And the method of administration? If not through food or drink, then how? Dr. Thornbury frowned. That is the puzzle, isn't it? The toxin would need to enter the bloodstream directly, either through injection, which I see no evidence of, or through some form of absorption through the skin. The skin, I interjected, but surely that would require an open wound of some sort. Not necessarily a wound, Captain Hastings, but certainly some break in the skin's integrity. Even small cuts or abrasions would suffice for certain types of poison. At this, Miss Hale spoke for the first time since the tragedy had occurred. Professor Selby's hands, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. He was always getting small cuts from handling old documents. The parchment edges, you know, and the metal clasps on ancient bindings. His fingers were constantly healing from tiny wounds. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Most observant, mademoiselle. And these cuts, they would be particularly concentrated where, on his fingertips, and along his fingers, where he turned pages, he was forever picking at healing cuts, a nervous habit of his. Indeed, Poirot approached the desk with extreme care, his gaze fixed upon the spilled contents of the silver ink pot. The dark blue ink had spread across the manuscript pages, creating an irregular stain that seemed to mock the professor's years of careful scholarship. Inspector Morrison of the Oxford Constabulary arrived as Dr. Thornbury was completing his more detailed examination. He was a solid, practical man, whose obvious discomfort with the unusual circumstances of the crime left considerable scope for Poirot's involvement. "Poison in an inkpot," he muttered, shaking his head. "In 30 years of police work, I've never encountered anything quite like it. How would anyone even think of such a method?" "Ah, but that is precisely what makes it so fishly clever," Poirot replied. "Consider, Inspector." The professor dips his pen into the ink. The toxic substance adheres to the pen. He handles the pen repeatedly as he writes, and the poison enters through the small wounds upon his fingers. It is a method that requires both intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and considerable sophistication in its execution. The inspector examined the inkpot with evident bewilderment, but who would have access to tamper with it? And when the thing was sitting right there on the desk, in full view of everyone, not quite everyone at all times, Poirot corrected gently. "We must determine when this particular inkpot was placed upon the desk, and by whom." Professor Selby mentioned it was a gift from Lady Margaret, 16th century, he said. Lady Margaret nodded mutely, her face still drained of colour. "And where was this valuable artifact normally kept?" Poirot inquired. Miss Hale gestured toward a glass-fronted cabinet near the window, locked away with the professor's other precious items. He only brought it out for special occasions. Poirot studied the cabinet, noting the small key that hung from a chain attached to Professor Selby's waistcoat. The implications were becoming clear. Whoever had poisoned the inkpot had needed not only access to this study, but also knowledge of where the inkpot was kept and when it would be used. As the inspector began the formal process of securing the scene, I found myself deeply troubled by the calculated nature of the crime. This was no sudden act of passion, but a meticulously planned murder that demonstrated both patience and a chilling understanding of the victim's scholarly habits. Chapter 5. Secrets and Motives. The following morning brought a grey December sky that seemed to mirror the sombre mood that had settled over Ashwell College. Inspector Morrison had arranged for us to use a small conference room adjacent to Professor Selby's study, where Poirot could conduct his methodical interrogation of each member of our tragic gathering. I had spent a restless night at the Randolph Hotel, my mind turning over the events of the previous evening. The image of Professor Selby collapsing across his manuscript remained vivid, as did the calculated nature of the murder method. Someone among our small company was a killer of remarkable cunning and cold determination. Poirot had insisted on interviewing each suspect separately, beginning with Dr. Julian Cross. The professor of history entered the room with the bearing of a man who had spent the night wrestling with unpleasant thoughts. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. His tie was slightly askew, and there were dark circles beneath his intelligent eyes. Dr. Poirot began with characteristic directness. "You were Professor Selby's colleague for many years. What was the nature of your professional relationship?" Dr. Cross shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We were colleagues, certainly. Not close friends, perhaps, but we maintained cordial relations. Cordial, yes, but not without rivalry." A flush crept up Dr. Cross's neck. "Academic discourse necessarily involves disagreement. Mr. Poirot, scholarly debate is the foundation of our profession. Indeed, and Professor Selby's research into Elizabeth and court secrets, this posed no particular challenge to your own work." The flush deepened. "I must confess, Mr. Poirot, that Edwin's discoveries threaten to undermine 30 years of my own scholarship. My definitive work on Elizabeth and court politics has been the standard text for decades. If his revelations proved accurate—" He paused, his voice becoming strained. "My entire professional reputation would have been demolished overnight." Poirot nodded with apparent sympathy. "A devastating prospect for any scholar. Tell me, when did you first learn the specific nature of his discoveries?" "Only yesterday morning. He telephoned me, barely able to contain his excitement. He spoke of documents that would revolutionize our understanding of Tudor loyalties, particularly regarding families who had built their reputations on carefully constructed myths. After the Cross departed, looking rather more haggarded than when he had entered. Lady Margaret Winthrop was announced. She moved with less of her previous aristocratic composure, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged her skirts. "Lady Margaret," Poirot said gently, "you have been most generous in your patronage of Professor Selby's research. What prompted such interest in his work?" "I have always believed in the importance of historical truth," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "The Winthrop family has supported academic endeavor for generations. Even when such truth might prove uncomfortable, Lady Margaret's composure cracked visibly. "Mr. Poirot, I must tell you that I had grave concerns about Edwin's research. My family's papers, which I had generously made available to him, contained materials that were never meant for public scrutiny. Materials concerning your ancestors' role in the Essex Rebellion, among other matters. Yes," her voice dropped to a whisper, "the Winthrop name has been honorable for 4 centuries. Edwin's revelations would have destroyed not only our historical reputation, but our standing in society, the family trust, our charitable foundations, our position in the community. All would have been irreparably damaged." When the graduate students were questioned, each revealed fragments of a larger picture. Young Peaton admitted to having accessed Professor Selby's research notes without permission, copying sections for his own thesis. Hartwell confessed to overhearing conversations between Selby and Miss Hale about the explosive nature of their discoveries. The third student, Morrison, revealed that there had been considerable tension in the department about Selby's secretive research methods. "Everyone knew he was working on something significant," young Morrison explained nervously, "but he kept it all very close to his chest. Some of the faculty felt excluded, even insulted by his secrecy. But it was Miss Dorothy Hale's interview that proved most revealing. She entered the room with the same quiet dignity I had observed the previous evening, though close examination revealed signs of considerable strain. "Miss Hale," Poirot began, "you have worked for Professor Selby for 20 years. You knew his habits, his methods, his secrets better than anyone." "I served Professor Selby faithfully," she replied with quiet pride. "His work was my work. I understood its importance better than anyone. Indeed, and you were privy to all his discoveries. I transcribed every document, organized every note, verified every reference. Without my assistance, his research would never have reached completion. Yet, despite this invaluable contribution, I understand you are not to be credited as co-author of his work." Miss Hale's composure faltered for the first time. "Professor Selby believed in traditional academic protocols. My role was to assist, not to claim authorship, even when the research was substantially your own." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Miss Hale's grey eyes flashed with something that might have been long-suppressed anger before she regained control. "I serve Professor Selby faithfully," she repeated, but her voice had taken on a harder edge. As each interview concluded, I found myself increasingly troubled by the web of motives that was emerging. Academic rivalry, social disgrace, professional theft, and unacknowledged contribution each provided compelling reason for murder. Yet the sophisticated nature of the crime suggested a mind capable of both meticulous planning and cold calculation. Chapter 6. The Locked Cabinet Mystery. Following the morning's interviews, Poirot insisted upon a thorough examination of Professor Selby's study. Inspector Morrison had released the scene for investigation, though the chalk outline on the carpet and the scattered ink-stained manuscript pages served as grim reminders of the previous evening's tragedy. "Observe, mon ami," Poirot said as we entered the panelled room. "The arrangement tells us much about the mind of our murderer. This was not a crime of impulse, but one requiring considerable forethought and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits." He approached the glass-fronted cabinet where the silver inkpot had normally resided. The small key still hung from Professor Selby's watch chain, which Inspector Morrison had carefully preserved as evidence. Poirot examined the lock with his magnifying glass, noting every detail with that methodical precision I had come to know so well. "Most interesting," he murmured. "The lock shows no signs of forced entry, yet someone had access to this cabinet yesterday afternoon to remove the inkpot." "But surely Professor Selby himself took it out," I suggested. "After all, it was to be a special occasion." "Ah, but that is precisely what we must determine." Poirot turned to Miss Hale, who had accompanied us to provide information about the professor's routines. "Mademoiselle, tell us about Professor Selby's preparations for yesterday evening. When did he request the inkpot be placed upon his desk?" Miss Hale's grey eyes were thoughtful behind her spectacles. "That is what I find so peculiar, Mr. Poirot. The professor never specifically requested the inkpot. When I arrived yesterday afternoon to make final preparations, it was already there, positioned prominently on his desk." "Already there? But who had access to this room and to the cabinet key?" The professor kept the key with him always, but Miss Hale hesitated. There were occasions when he would remove it to access various items. During afternoon tea, for instance, he would often lay his watch chain aside while handling delicate documents. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "And who would be present during these afternoon tea sessions?" "Various people, depending on the day, colleagues, students, visitors to the college. Yesterday afternoon, Dr. Pross called to discuss some administrative matter. Lady Margaret stopped by to confirm the evening's arrangements, and of course I was in and out of the study throughout the day. We questioned Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper who maintained the professor's rooms. She was a straightforward woman who had served the college for 30 years, and her testimony proved illuminating. "Oh, yes, sir," she told Poirot. "The professor was most particular about that inkpot. Beautiful thing it was. 16th century. Lady Margaret told him when she presented it last Christmas he only brought it out for special world occasions, and then he'd handle it like it was made of spun glass. And yesterday, did you observe anything unusual about the professor's study?" Mrs. Whitmore considered carefully. "Well, I did notice the inkpot was out on the desk when I came to dust at 3. Struck me as odd, since the professor wasn't even in the room at the time. Usually he'd be present when handling his precious things. The professor was absent at 3. Where might he have been?" "Teaching his advanced Tudor history seminar," Miss Hale interjected. "He was always punctual about his lectures, 2:30 to 4 every Wednesday." This revelation cast an entirely new light upon the matter. Someone had placed the poisoned inkpot upon the desk, while Professor Selby was safely occupied elsewhere, knowing his habits well enough to predict that he would use it for the evening's presentation. Poirot next examined the inkpot itself, which Inspector Morrison had carefully preserved. The ornate silver piece was indeed beautiful, decorated with Tudor roses and bearing the unmistakable patina of age. More importantly, traces of the poison were still visible, as a slight discoloration in the remaining ink. "Most ingenious," Poirot observed. "The poison was mixed directly into the ink, not merely coated upon the surface of the pot. This suggests someone with considerable knowledge of chemistry, as well as access to rare toxins. Could such substances be obtained easily?" I inquired. Certain alkaloid poisons might be available to someone with the right connections, a person involved in botanical research perhaps, or someone with access to a well-equipped laboratory. We learned from the college porter that several people had visited the building during the crucial afternoon hours. Dr. Cross had indeed called, remaining closeted with Professor Selby for nearly an hour. Lady Margaret had arrived shortly after his departure, spending some 20 minutes in private conversation with the professor. The 3 graduate students had come and gone throughout the day, as was their normal practice. Miss Hale herself had been present continuously, though she emphasized her devotion to maintaining the professor's schedule and ensuring his comfort. I was constantly occupied with correspondence and manuscript preparation, she explained. The professor required everything to be perfect for the evening's presentation. As we concluded our examination of the study, I found myself increasingly disturbed by the implications of our discoveries. The murder required not only access to the locked cabinet, but intimate knowledge of Professor Selby's habits and schedule. Furthermore, the sophistication of the poison suggested someone with specialized knowledge, possibly someone within the academic community itself. Poirot stood before the empty cabinet, his green eyes reflecting deep thought. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the room, emphasizing the scholarly atmosphere that had been so violently disrupted by murder. In that moment I realized that our investigation was focusing inexorably upon someone who had been trusted implicitly by the victim, someone whose very devotion might have provided the perfect cover for the most calculated of betrayals. Chapter 7. The Devoted Secretary's Secret. The breakthrough in our investigation came, as these matters often do, from the most mundane of sources. Poirot had requested access to Professor Selby's private papers, and Inspector Morrison had grudgingly agreed, provided we conducted our examination under official supervision. It was while sorting through the professor's correspondence that Poirot discovered a folder marked Personal Affairs, a collection of documents that revealed a side of Edwin Selby quite different from the dedicated scholar we had known among bank statements and household accounts. We found his most recent will dated only 3 months prior. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, as he studied the document with careful attention. "Professor Selby has been most generous to various academic institutions and charities, but observe, Hastings, there is no provision whatsoever for Miss Hale." I examined the will with growing astonishment. After 20 years of devoted service, Miss Dorothy Hale, who had been present for every aspect of the professor's research, was mentioned only in passing as someone to be given a suitable reference for future employment. "Surely this must be an oversight," I suggested. "Perhaps an earlier will provided for her." Poirot's investigation of the professor's filing system soon revealed a draft of a will from the previous year. In this earlier version, Miss Hale had been left a substantial bequest, enough to ensure her comfortable retirement. But the recent will had eliminated this provision entirely. But why would he change his mind so dramatically? I wondered aloud. The answer came in the form of a series of letters we discovered in Professor Selby's private desk drawer. Correspondence between the professor and his solicitor, discussing concerns about Miss Hale's presumptuous attitude regarding the manuscript and her inappropriate expectations of credit for work performed in the capacity of secretary. One letter dated barely a month ago was particularly revealing. "My dear Thornfield, I have decided that Miss Hale has overstepped the bounds of her position. While her assistance has been valuable, she appears to believe herself entitled to recognition as a co-researcher rather than as the clerical assistant she has always been. I cannot allow such presumption to go uncorrected. The new will should make clear the distinction between employer and employee." Inspector Morrison whistled softly when Poirot read this passage aloud. "That puts rather a different complexion on things, doesn't it?" But there was more. Hidden beneath a stack of research notes, we discovered a file that contained what appeared to be Miss Hale's own scholarly work, detailed analyses of Elizabeth and documents, innovative research methodologies, and insights that formed the very foundation of Professor Selby's manuscript. Her neat handwriting covered page after page of original research, much of which had been incorporated wholesale into the professor's work. "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed as he examined these documents. "It appears that Miss Hale was far more than a secretary. She was in effect the co-author of Professor Selby's research, yet she was to receive no credit, no recognition, and now no compensation. The final piece of evidence came in the form of a carbon copy of a letter Professor Selby had written to the publisher of his forthcoming book. In it, he had explicitly credited another scholar, Dr. Margaret Ashworth of Cambridge, with research assistance that had clearly been performed by Miss Hale. "But this is monstrous," I exclaimed. "How could he treat someone so shamefully after 20 years of faithful service? Academic ambition, monamy, can corrupt even the most scholarly of souls. Professor Selby appears to have been unwilling to share the glory of his discoveries with anyone, particularly not with a woman who lacked formal academic credentials. We found Miss Hale in the college library, working quietly at a desk, surrounded by the familiar tools of her trade, index cards, reference books, and neat stacks of typed pages. She looked up as we approached, her grey eyes showing no surprise at our arrival. "Miss Hale," Poirot said gently, "we have been examining Professor Selby's private papers. There are matters we must discuss." She set down her pen with careful precision and folded her hands in her lap. "I wondered when you would discover the truth about my situation. You knew about the changes to his will." "I typed the final draft myself, Mr. Poirot. It was one of my last duties." Her voice remained steady, but I detected her underlying current of long-suppressed emotion. 20 years of service, and I was to be dismissed with a reference. 20 years of research, and my name was to appear nowhere in his work. "The research in your files, it represents substantial original scholarship." Miss Hale's composure cracked slightly. "I discovered 3 of the most crucial documents myself. I developed the analytical framework that made sense of the contradictory evidence. I spent countless evenings and weekends pursuing leads that Professor Selby was too busy to investigate, and yet in his manuscript I was to be mentioned only as my capable secretary, Miss H." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable now, years of resentment finally finding expression. But as quickly as the emotion had surfaced, she regained control, her professional mask sliding back into place. As we walked back across the college quadrangle, I found myself deeply troubled by what we had uncovered. The picture that was emerging was one of systematic exploitation. A brilliant woman whose contributions had been minimized, whose loyalty had been taken for granted, and whose future had been carelessly discarded by the very man she had served so faithfully. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. By evening, Poirot had requested that all members of our tragic gathering assemble once more in Professor Selby's study. Inspector Morrison had agreed to this unconventional arrangement, though I could see he harbored considerable skepticism about my friend's methods. The room had been restored to some semblance of order, though the chalk outline and stained carpet served as grim reminders of the previous night's events. Dear Margaret arrived first, her aristocratic composure somewhat restored, though her hands still trembled slightly as she took her seat. Dr. Cross followed, his scholarly demeanor masking what I suspected was considerable anxiety. The 3 graduate students filed in quietly, their young faces marked by the strain of the past 24 hours. Miss Hale entered last, moving with her characteristic quiet efficiency, though I now observed her with entirely different eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, positioning himself beside the professor's desk, where the silver ink pot had been returned to its fatal prominence. "We gathered tonight to discuss the death of Professor Edwin Selby, a death that initially appeared to be the tragic consequence of some unknown medical condition, but which has proven to be murder, most carefully planned and expertly executed." He paused, allowing his green eyes to survey each face in turn. The method employed was both ingenious and revealing. Professor Selby was poisoned by a rare alkaloid toxin that had been mixed into the ink of this very ink pot, a substance that entered his bloodstream through the small cuts upon his fingers, wounds he had acquired through years of handling ancient documents. Lady Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but surely anyone could have tampered with the ink pot. It was sitting there in plain view. "Ah, but that is precisely where our murderer displayed such cunning," Poirot replied. "This ink pot, as we learned, was normally kept locked in Professor Selby's glass cabinet. It was only brought out for special occasions, and yesterday it appeared upon his desk while he was teaching his afternoon seminar, placed there by someone who possessed both access to the cabinet and intimate knowledge of his habits. Dr. Cross cleared his throat nervously. But several of us had access to the study yesterday afternoon. How can you possibly determine which of us the murderer revealed himself, or rather herself? Through a combination of opportunity, knowledge, and motive, Poirot interrupted gently. Let us consider each suspect in turn. Dr. Cross, you possessed both the academic knowledge to obtain such a poison and a compelling motive, the destruction of your life's work. Yet you lacked the intimate familiarity with Professor Selby's daily routines necessary to plan such a precise attack. Dr. Cross sagged with visible relief, though shame colored his features at the exposure of his professional jealousy. Lady Margaret, Poirot continued, you feared the revelation of your family's historical secrets and possessed the financial means to acquire rare substances. But the timing of the crime during Professor Selby's lecture provided you with a perfect alibi, as college records confirm you were meeting with the dean at that precise time. Then who? Lady Margaret began, but Poirot raised his hand for silence. The murderer required 3 essential elements: intimate knowledge of Professor Selby's habits, access to the locked cabinet, and a motive powerful enough to drive someone to such desperate measures. Only one person possessed all 3 requirements. He turned to face Miss Hale, who sat with perfect composure, her hands folded in her lap. Miss Dorothy Hale, for 20 years you served Professor Selby with exemplary devotion. You knew his routines better than anyone. You had countless opportunities to access his cabinet key, and you possessed, as we discovered today, perhaps the most compelling motive of all. Miss Hale's grey eyes met Pooh steadily. And what motive might that be, Mr. Poirot? The theft of intellectual achievement. You were not merely Professor Selby's secretary. You were the true architect of his research, the discoverer of crucial documents, the developer of analytical methods that made his manuscript possible. Yet you were to receive no credit, no recognition, and, as his recent will demonstrated, no compensation for your years of scholarly contribution. For the first time since we had known her, Miss Hale's composure cracked completely. 20 years, she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. 20 years of my life, my mind, my discoveries, and he planned to dismiss me with a reference while crediting my work to Dr. Ashworth of Cambridge, a woman who had never seen the documents I uncovered. Your method was as scholarly as your motive, Poirot observed, with something approaching sympathy. You chose a poison that would act through his habitual handling of documents, using an inkpot that symbolized both his scholarship and your exclusion from it. If you could not write your name in his book, you would ensure he never wrote another word. Miss Hale straightened in her chair, her dignity returning even in defeat. He made one crucial error. Mr. Poirot. He underestimated the intellectual capacity of his capable secretary. I may lack formal credentials, but I possess something he never had, a true understanding of justice. Inspector Morrison stepped forward, with his handcuffs, though Miss Hale rose to meet him with quiet composure. As she was led away, she paused at the door and looked back at the ink-stained manuscript that lay scattered across Professor Selby's desk. My research dies with him, she said simply. Perhaps that is justice enough. The study fell silent after her departure, the weight of scholarly ambition and betrayed loyalty hanging heavy in the air. As we prepared to leave Oxford the following morning, I reflected upon the tragedy of 2 brilliant minds destroyed by pride and exploitation, one by poison, the other by the inexorable machinery of justice. The unfinished manuscript remained upon the desk, its revelations forever lost, stained not only with ink, but with the bitter consequences of academic betrayal. Thank you for joining us for Murder at Ashwell College. What did you think of tonight's mystery? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you liked this mystery, please subscribe to Whispers of the Night and consider joining our membership for ad-free listening and exclusive tales. Till next time, this is Alfie signing off from Whispers of the Night.